Hello there, welcome to my channel. My name's Annette with Sunbeam Fabric Art. Today I've got a fun project for you. It is this quilt top. Now if you follow my channel, you know I've been doing recreations of an old block called Merry England. I've done it 3 different ways now. So I had these extra blocks and I thought I need to make these into a quilt. So I had a lot of scraps left over as well from these teal colors, these blue colors, beautiful, beautiful prints, blacks and whites. And I wanted to make some crazy quilt blocks to add to this quilt to make a finished quilt. And I did, and I'm going to take you along and show you what I did with my scraps and how I made many, many scrappy crazy quilt blocks. So come along with me today and I'll show you what I did. The first thing I did was lay out the Merry England blocks that I had, just to see how they would work in a finished quilt top. I will leave links in the description for all these videos on the blocks that I've already done. The top 2 and the bottom block measure 16.5 inches square. That giant middle block is 24 inches square. So I tried to figure out what could I do to get these all into one quilt. As usual, I just started drawing on some pieces of paper to see if I could come up with some ideas, and I did. I am going to show you this again. I redrew it on a white sheet of paper so you could actually see. On my top row, I've got those two 16.5 inch squares, and I've got panels on the side that I'm going to be making from scraps, and the squiggly line between everything is sashing. And then I needed 2 panels on each side of the 24 inch block and 2 more panels below on that 16.5 inch square block. Now I've got all my measurements there. Feel free to take a screenshot or copy them, but depending on what you're making, you might have completely different measurements. My scrap bin is tucked away in my closet and it's pretty scary right now, so I was more than happy to pull this scrap bin out. I started pulling out the blues, the teal, the black, the white, all the scraps that were left over from these lovely Merry England blocks that I made. Now I also found a lovely leftover piece of this black background floral print, and I decided I was going to use that as my focus print for my crazy quilt blocks. And I wanted to try making crazy quilt blocks with a triangle to start, an odd rectangle shape, and then some 5-sided shapes as well. So I just cut some various shapes out of this floral print. Now I'm going to make these crazy quilt blocks in the video a couple of different ways. To start with, I'm going to take a 5-sided shape and I am just going to start sewing fabric to sides. So I'm going to pick a side and sew a strip of fabric, press it open, sew a strip to another side, press it open, and continue until the block is as large as I need it to be. One thing you'll notice me doing as I keep adding strips, once I stitch my seam, I'm trimming away excess fabric before I press. Now here, as I'm approaching the end of this particular section, you can see I'm taking advantage of some scrap fabric that I trimmed from a previous Merry England block. It's a nice triangle shape, and hey, I needed a triangle right there, so I'm just stitching it on, and then my little block section is now as large as I need it to be. After trimming this little section up, I've got a nice, beautiful crazy quilt rectangle. My next crazy quilt block for this quilt, I am starting with a rectangle. It's not a perfect rectangle. I cut it out with my scissors. Just like the 5-sided shape, we're going to add a little strip to one side, stitch it, press it open. Add to another side, stitch it, press it open, and keep adding fabric until you get the block the size that you want it to be. Now, one little tip, which you will see me doing here and there in this video, if you're using a 4-sided shape to start, or anything larger than 4 sides, you can sew 2 strips at a time. So you can just pick out 2 sides, sew down one side, flip the block around, sew down the other side, trim, and press 2 at once. Now, one thing you'll notice, this rectangle crazy quilt start, it did not stay a rectangle. It turned kind of wonky, which I was perfectly okay with. I love a wonky crazy quilt block. And you can see on this section, I'm using some more of my trimmed off pieces from those Merry England blocks. And here is another finished panel. This is going to go on one side or the other of one of my Merry England blocks. So I needed a small 4-inch panel, so I started with a very small triangle. And I thought a triangle crazy quilt block was going to be very cool, and I still think that would be very cool. However, by adding some of these cast-off sections from the Merry England blocks, I lost my triangle. I feel like, I mean, it's still there, but I feel like I lost the whole triangle crazy quilt thing that I was trying to do. Of course, you know, now this has sparked another light bulb moment for me. I am going to use some scraps and do a completely triangle crazy quilt. So I'm excited about thinking about that for a future project. Well, for my next panel, I am starting with a bit of a larger 5-sided shape. I needed a larger one because the panel is a little bit wider, so I am going to try and make a giant panel here, starting with this 5-sided shape. I slowed this section down a little bit. I want you to notice that I've got my ruler handy. I kept getting my ruler out to kind of see how big this block was getting and how much bigger I needed to make it. I really don't like doing the block this way without being able to see. As you're going to see later on in this video, the very last crazy quilt block is my favorite way to do them, and I'll share that with you here pretty shortly. My next little panel section, I started with a cast-off from the Merry England blocks, and it was already a rectangle. It was just a stripy piece that is a rectangle. So I treated that like my rectangle center of my Crazy Quilt block. Just started going around the outside edges and adding and adding and adding until it was the size I needed it to be. And you see I've got the ruler there again, and I'm just checking with the ruler frequently to make sure it's the right size. And here is a look at those two blocks that I just finished. I really love the five-sided shape, the best for crazy quilts. But this one looks cute too with that little stripe section in the middle. Now I'm not going to bore you by making you watch me sew strips of scraps together. This is not a strip scrap video. But I did want you to know I had a lot of these little scraps and I needed to have some more fabric to add to my Crazy Quilt blocks and to add to these panels I was making. So I did stop, take some time, started sewing two pieces together, then I sewed 2 to 2 to make 4, and I continued on until I had enough of these scraps sewn together to add to my Crazy Quilt blocks. The main thing I wanted to show you with these scraps is that after I put a bunch of them together, I cut out a 5-sided shape. So you will see one of the Crazy Quilt blocks at the end. It has this stripy, scrappy, 5-sided shape as the center. And just like the other 5-sided shapes, it makes no difference. I am starting with the center and I am adding strips going around and around and around the center of this block to see what happens. And this is one of the blocks where you will notice I'm adding 2 strips at a time. I'm stitching down one side, flipping the block around, stitching to the other side, trimming, and then pressing both strips open at the same time. And again, on this block, you'll see I have to keep referring back to this ruler, and I do have a large 20-inch ruler, and it's just kind of a pain to keep going back to the ruler and seeing how much larger I need to make this block. So I can't wait to show you my favorite way to make these blocks. All right, it is time. Let's spend some time letting me tell you all about how I love to make Crazy Quilt blocks. One of the reasons I like this way, I feel like it avoids a lot of excess waste. The first thing I did was take some newsprint paper and I taped 4 sheets together. The panel size I need to make is 13.5 by 16.5. So I made sure that my 4 sheets of paper were a little bit larger than that. I'm going to start with my 5-sided shape right in the middle of this paper and start sewing strips right onto the paper. And my tip for you, if you're using tape to hold paper together, when you go to press your seams open, you'll notice you need to be very, very careful. Do not place your iron on the tape. That will stick to your iron, it will melt the tape, and you will have a big mess. Now my other tip about sewing on paper, you may have seen in my foundation paper piecing videos, Set your stitch length to 1.8 or less. This will perforate that paper and make it very easy to remove later. You can see as I'm trimming off the little excess bits before I take it to the iron to press, I kind of am tearing back a little bit because, you know, it is stitched down to the paper, but that 1.8 stitch length or less makes it very easy to kind of tear it back gently so I can trim it away. As I'm getting to the end of this block, you can see the advantage to sewing on this foundation. As I approach the end, I can see exactly what size of strips I need to complete these corners. Okay, I'll just say it now, of all the blocks in this quilt, this one is my very favorite. I just love it. I love the colors, I love the shapes. I just love this block. Now here is a look at the back. The foundation, the piece of paper, actually 4 sheets of paper that I taped together. I am going to take some time and gently remove all the paper before I trim the block. Now, I am not going to spend much time on the finishing of this quilt. I'll take you through it really quickly. Here's my initial layout with my panels and my Merry England blocks. I will leave a link in the description to my playlist for quilt finishing if you're interested in that. My first step was to lay these blocks out with the sashing on each side, and I'm using 2.5-inch white strips. Then I sewed the strips between each row. Then I trimmed to square up these sides, and I've got to tell you, my rows were not all the same size. They varied by about 1/2 inch each. Since the rows were not exactly the same size, I used the center line on the 2 large Merry England blocks in the center to match that up and line it up, along with that center piece of sashing on the top row, and that made everything line up nice and straight. And here is a look at that finished quilt top, all trimmed up and ready to finish. I had a lot of fun making this quilt, and I'm going to leave you with a little slideshow of all the various crazy quilt blocks that I made in this quilt. Let's start with my very favorite, and here it is. Right on top, I just love this block. It's my favorite. I wish I could make more like it, but of course it's unique. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you had fun. I hope to see you back again real soon.